Hi, and welcome to ThreatTraq Essentials, where we're going to look at some of the everyday cybersecurity lessons that we can learn from this week's ThreatTraq stories. I'm here with Matt Kaiser, who was on the show this week. Matt, let's talk about some of the stories. The first two really dealt with the difference between source code and compiled code. For those who may not be familiar with, just explain the difference between those two things for me.
Sure, so source code is the code that a human being would write. So it's in a higher level language that's a little bit easier for a human to write. And then what you will do is take that and you'll run it through a compiler. And the compiler takes what you wrote and puts it into code that the machine can understand. And then the machine will run that compiled code.
So that's what came into play in both these stories.
That's right.
Let's talk about the one you brought to us, which was about firmware. That was mostly in IoT devices?
Right. So the story that I brought talked about firmware security, and in particular, there was a survey done of a huge number of different firmware samples that were provided to this independent testing lab. And they found that there are certain things you can do within your compiler to make your code automatically more secure. Certain things you can tell it by passing different flags when you compile your code and say, enable this security feature, enable this other security feature.
And I guess what they found is that's not really being done anywhere near as much as it should be done.
Correct, and they did a survey across 15 years worth of firmware to say, have we seen any significant improvement over time? And they found that the improvements in that time period were almost negligible.
So what does that mean for the average user? Does it mean buyer beware when it comes to IoT devices? What other sorts of lessons can we take away from this?
Hopefully, what comes out of this is that there's some sort of standard, some sort of marking that you can put on an IoT device to say, this brand is doing it right, and then use it as almost a selling point to say that, compared to our competitors, we're doing the following things right. You've heard about IoT security, you should be concerned about it, and we are the brand that does it right, and therefore, put it on the box, and hopefully people will start using that as a way of determining what to buy.
Hopefully that day will come soon, so in the meantime, keep an eye out for that. Let's talk about the story Mike Stair brought to us, which was about vulnerabilities in Webmin, right? Yep. Which is used for web servers. Tell me what happened there.
So Webmin is what the name would suggest, a web-based administration tool for web servers. So you load this code on your server and allows you to log in over the web and make some changes instead of having to log in some other less convenient way. What was found is that there were vulnerabilities in here. I think it was a remote code execution vulnerability, typically a pretty serious one.
That means someone can go in and just pretty much
run what they want.
Yeah, do whatever they want
yes.
on the device, right? Yeah.
But the interesting thing in this case is that people went back to the source code and said, okay, where is this bug being introduced? And it wasn't in the source code. And typically, like I said before, you take your source code, you run it through your compiler, you get your compiled code. And you would imagine that your source code and your final code are, pretty much analogs of each other. But in this case, it seems that the compiler itself was introducing something else to the code that was never specified by the developers. Now that's a problem.
And that was something nefarious, right?
That was something nefarious, and they're continuing to investigate that now.
So is there a bigger lesson here about trust in general when it comes to cybersecurity for the average user, that you have to know, be aware of all the things that you trust in a process, whether it's buying software, buying a device, running it, going to a website? Is it a big lesson?
If you have the opportunity to make a decision as to where your software comes from, take it a little bit of time and think about it.
And trust, only download from trusted sources and
right,
things like that.
And there are places that you can download software from that are much better decisions than trying to find a pirate copy of software or downloading from outside of an approved store, because there are things that people are doing, signing their code to make it known that they're the one who wrote it and they're the one who provided it to you and no one else has tampered with it. These things exist. So I wouldn't tell people to panic. It's not like some sort of existential crisis within software that you have to trust every single person or not trust every single person. But you can make an intelligent decision with a little bit of knowledge.
That's always good advice. Let's talk about Joe's story. Joe Harden brought us a story about HTTP2, which is HTTP is a protocol that's runs pretty much the internet, right? Is that kind of...
Well, it runs the web. I mean, if you're familiar with anything that you've viewed in a web browser, HTTP is probably the protocol it was provided over. HTTP2 is the next generation of that protocol. It's got a whole bunch of extra features built into it to improve the speed or the functionality of HTTP.
And unfortunately discovered a lot of vulnerabilities as well.
Yes, there were a number of vulnerabilities that were reported. I think folks from Netflix and Google reported them. There are patches for those vulnerabilities. There are vendors who are working to patch and provide patches to the folks who maintain the software that relies on HTTP2. For most people, the best thing to do here is just make sure that you're up to date with your security patches. I wouldn't worry about it so much.
So the advice here would really be just to keep all that software up to date, keep up to date with your security patches. So.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, great. Thanks for being here, Matt.
Sure.
And thanks for being here with us on ThreatTraq Essentials. As always, you can click on the playlist below to take a deeper dive into any of these stories. And we'll see you next time.